For more than 100 years, the story of the Titanic has been etched in our minds as a terrible, tragic accident. But the source material we're looking at today, it paints a completely different picture, one that reframes this disaster not as an accident, but as a crime. So, let's open the case file and get into this forensic audit.
You know the story, right? The unsinkable ship, the iceberg, the tragic sinking. It's simple. It's what we've always been told. But the analysis we're exploring today asks you to just set that story aside for a minute. It argues this wasn't just a tragedy. It was premeditated.
And there you have it. That's the core argument of the source, laid out plain and simple. It's saying the sinking was no accident at all, but a meticulously planned operation with a very, very specific goal. So if it was an assassination, who was the target, and what could possibly be the motive?
To get the why behind this whole thing, our source material says we need to rewind the clock. We're going back 2 years before the Titanic even set sail, to a super-secret meeting on a private island off the coast of Georgia, a place called Jekyll Island. Now, this timeline is absolutely central to the source's entire argument. It connects these 3 huge events and presents them not as some random coincidences, but as a direct chain of cause and effect. See, first this secret plan for a central bank gets hatched. Then, the main people standing in its way are eliminated. And finally, with that opposition gone, the plan is signed into law. Okay, so let's take a closer look at the actual people who were apparently in the way, and, the so-called weapon that was used to get rid of them.
According to the source, these 3 men right here were the last major roadblock. We're talking about John Jacob Astor IV, literally the wealthiest man on the planet, Benjamin Guggenheim, an industrialist with a fortune in mining, and Isidor Straus, a co-owner of Macy's who had massive political pull. The argument is that these guys were so powerful, they couldn't be bought off or pushed aside. They had to be, removed from the board entirely.
So that brings us to the weapon. And it's not what you think. The source claims it wasn't an iceberg. It puts forward this theory of a massive insurance fraud scheme, claiming the ship that sank wasn't even the Titanic. It was its older, beat-up sister ship, the Olympic. See, the Olympic had been in a bad collision and was a huge financial drain for its owner, J.P. Morgan. So the theory goes, while the 2 ships were sitting side by side in the shipyard, they were secretly swapped. The damaged Olympic was passed off as the brand-new Titanic and then sent on its maiden voyage to be deliberately sunk, killing 2 birds with 1 stone, eliminating the targets and cashing in on a giant insurance policy.
All right, so with the motive, the targets, and the weapon supposedly established, the source starts laying out a series of really strange anomalies, a pattern that it says turns simple negligence into something that looks a lot more like deliberate sabotage. First on the list, the cancellations. J.P. Morgan himself, the man who owned the ship and was a huge player behind the Federal Reserve Plan, cancels his trip at the very last second. He even had his priceless art collection taken off the ship. And it wasn't just him. Other powerful friends of his also backed out. The source basically asks, did they know something? Next up, the ship was essentially sailing blind. Can you believe this? Because of a last-minute crew change, the key for the locker where they kept the binoculars was accidentally left on shore. This meant the lookouts had to use just their eyes to spot icebergs in a known ice field on a moonless night. The source also claims the ship was already damaged before it even left port. Apparently, a huge fire had been smoldering away in one of the coal bunkers for weeks, heating the steel bulkhead to over 1,800 degrees. That kind of heat would have made the steel super brittle and weak, and guess what? It was in the exact spot where the iceberg ended up hitting. Then you have the ship speed. The Titanic got at least 6 different, very clear warnings about huge ice fields directly in its path, and yet the captain kept the ship racing along at nearly full speed. That's a huge violation of basic maritime rules. The source contends he must have been acting under direct orders. And what about their call for help? Look, the law of the sea is crystal clear. Red flares mean distress. But for some reason, the Titanic was only stocked with white flares, the kind you'd use for a party. So when a nearby ship saw them going off, their crew just thought, oh, they're having a big celebration over there, and just sailed on. And maybe this is the final piece of the alleged sabotage puzzle, the SS Californian. This ship was sitting right there, stopped in the ice, only about 10 or 15 miles away. But its radio operator had been told to shut off his radio and go to bed, just minutes before the Titanic sent out its first SOS. The closest possible rescue was made completely deaf and blind to the disaster.
So, according to this forensic audit, the ship sinks, the targets are eliminated. What's the fallout? What happens next? Well, what the three most powerful opponents of a private central bank did, the whole political landscape in America just fundamentally changed. The biggest obstacle to the plan was now, quite literally, at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean.
And wouldn't you know it, just a little over a year and a half later, the plan that was born on Jekyll Island became law. The Federal Reserve Act was passed by Congress, and it changed the American financial system forever. So in the end, the source material presents this chain of events not as some wild theory, but as a serious indictment. It asks us to look at history not just as a series of accidents, but as a sequence of calculated operations. It challenges the official story we all know and leaves us with a pretty big question. If this story is even remotely plausible, what else have we been told that might be worth a second look?